Lightning split the sky the night Jim Thorpe was born. The Sac and Fox called it a sign. He would grow up to become the greatest athlete the world had ever seen. An Olympic champion, a football legend, a founder of the NFL. And he would die broke, disgraced, and buried far from his people. This is not just a sports story. It's a story about genius, injustice, and a system that builds legends, then destroys them. From a stormlit cabin in Indian Territory to Olympic gold in Stockholm. From American hero to a man stripped of everything he earned. They called him Wa-Tho-Huk, the path lit by lightning. This is the life, the rise, and the cost of greatness. This is Jim Thorpe. The storm. May 28, 1887. A thunderstorm raged over the North Canadian River in what would become Oklahoma. Lightning split the sky above a one-room cabin built from cottonwood and hickory. Inside, Charlotte Via Thorpe gave birth to twin boys. The Sac and Fox people believed that birth during a storm carried meaning. The first twin, Charles, entered the world as thunder rolled. The second, James Francis, arrived as lightning illuminated the cabin walls. Charlotte's people gave the second twin a name, Wa-Tho-Huk, bright path. Some translations said path lit by lightning. The name would prove prophetic. Jim Thorpe's life would arc across the American sky like lightning, brilliant, impossible to ignore, and ultimately burning too fast. "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world," King Gustav V of Sweden would tell him 25 years later. The king had no idea he was also addressing a man whose path would be lit by loss, tragedy, and betrayal as much as by triumph. This is the story of how an orphaned Native American boy from Oklahoma became the most versatile athlete in history. How he conquered the Olympics, revolutionized football, played professional baseball, and helped found the National Football League. And how, despite achieving immortality in sports, he died poor, alone, and fighting battles that had nothing to do with athletics. This is the story of Jim Thorpe, the greatest athlete who ever lived, and the man who paid the highest price for greatness. The Vanishing World. Indian Territory, 1887 to 1901. Hiram Thorpe was not a gentle man, part Irish, part Sac and Fox. He was what neighbors called a cowboy Indian ruffian. He'd have 5 wives and 19 children during his lifetime. Jim and his twin Charlie were sons from his third wife, Charlotte. Hiram was a farmer, a blacksmith, a hunter. He taught his sons to track deer, to trap, to ride horses bareback across the prairie. By age 3, Jim could swim in the river that ran near their land. He learned to endure cold, heat, hunger, the kind of endurance that would later make him legendary. But the Thorpe boys were growing up in a world that was disappearing. The Sac and Fox Nation had once controlled vast territories across the Midwest. Jim's great-great-grandfather on his mother's side was Black Hawk, the legendary warrior chief who had fought to protect his people's land. But by the time Jim was born, the reservation system had confined his people to a small portion of Oklahoma. And even that was being stolen. White settlers pushed into Indian Territory, claiming thousands of acres through legal manipulation and outright theft. The land grabs represented Jim's first real loss, watching his people's world shrink year by year. The twins were inseparable. Where Charles went, James followed. They hunted together, swam together, got in trouble together. Charlotte would find them covered in mud from the river, laughing. Then came the government schools. In 1898, when the twins were 9, Hiram sent them to the Sac and Fox Indian Agency School near Stroud, Oklahoma. The U.S. government's policy toward Native Americans was explicit: kill the Indian, save the man. Boarding schools were designed to strip indigenous children of their culture, language, and identity. Jim hated it: the regimentation, the punishment for speaking his native language, the brutal discipline. He ran away repeatedly, sometimes traveling 23 miles on foot to get home. Then, in the winter of 1897, Charles got sick. Pneumonia, the doctors said. In those days before antibiotics, pneumonia killed quickly. Charles Thorpe died at age 9. Jim never spoke much about his twin's death, but those who knew him said something changed. The playful boy became quieter, more distant. He ran away from school again, and this time he didn't come back. Hiram didn't know what to do with his grieving, angry son. In 1898, he sent Jim to the Haskell Indian Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, 270 miles away. If anything, Haskell was worse than the agency school. More rules, harsher punishments, longer distances from home. Jim lasted 2 years before running away again. He was 12 when he returned home to find his mother dying. Charlotte Vere Thorpe had contracted blood poisoning. In November of 1901, she died. Jim watched his father bury her in the Sacred Heart Cemetery. 2 years later, Hiram was cleaning his gun when it accidentally discharged. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but infection set in. Jim's father died slowly over several weeks. At 15 years old, Jim Thorpe was an orphan, his twin brother dead, his mother dead, his father dead, his people's land taken, their culture under assault. Most boys would have been broken by such losses. Jim Thorpe was forged by them. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 1904 to 1912. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania was the flagship of the government's assimilation program. Founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt, who coined the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man," Carlisle processed indigenous children like products on an assembly line. Haircut, native clothes burned, names changed, languages forbidden, culture erased. When 16-year-old Jim Thorpe arrived at Carlisle in 1904, he expected more of the same misery. What he found instead was Glenn Scobie Warner. Everyone called him Pop. Warner was the head football coach, and he was building something revolutionary. If the government wanted to use Carlisle to prove Indians could be civilized, Warner would use Carlisle to prove Indians could dominate. His football teams beat Harvard, Army, Penn State, the elite white institutions of American athletics. Every victory was a thumb in the eye of those who saw Native Americans as inferior. But Warner hadn't noticed Jim Thorpe yet. Jim was just another student assigned to work in the tailor shop playing intramural sports. Spring of 1907 changed everything. Jim was walking past a track practice when he saw students attempting the high jump. The bar was set at 5 feet 9 inches, a respectable height. Students in proper athletic gear were failing to clear it. Jim, still wearing his work clothes and heavy shoes, asked if he could try. The other students laughed, this scrawny kid in overalls. Jim took several steps back, measured the distance with his eyes, and ran. He cleared 5 feet 9 inches with room to spare, landed clean, walked away. The track coach grabbed him. "Who are you?" "Jim Thorpe." "You're coming to practice tomorrow." But Jim didn't show up. He'd already lost interest. Warner himself had to track him down. "Son, what you did yesterday, that's not normal. You have a gift." Jim shrugged. "It was just a jump." "Just a jump," Warner said. "You broke the school record wearing overalls." Warner convinced Jim to try football. In his first scrimmage, playing against the varsity as a practice dummy, Jim took a handoff and ran through 11 would-be tacklers. Warner stopped practice. "Gentlemen," he told his first-string team, "you just let an Indian boy in overalls make you look like elementary school children." Jim made the team. But his attendance at Carlisle remained erratic. He'd disappear for months, working odd jobs, playing semi-professional baseball for small-town teams in North Carolina. The baseball would come back to haunt him. But in 1909, Warner finally convinced Jim to stay and focus. What followed was one of the most dominant stretches in college football history. At 5 feet 11 inches and 185 pounds, Jim wasn't the biggest player, but he combined speed, power, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate. He played halfback, but also kicked field goals, punted, and played defense. In an era before specialization, Jim did everything. Poet Marion Moore, who taught Jim at Carlisle, recalled, "He had a kind of ease in his gait that is hard to describe. It looked like he was hardly trying, but he'd glide past defenders like they were standing still." November 19th, 1911, Carlisle versus Harvard at Harvard Stadium. The undefeated Crimson, coached by the legendary Percy Horton, were overwhelming favorites. Jim kicked 4 field goals that day, 2 from over 40 yards. Carlisle won 18-15. Harvard's campus fell silent. A year later, November 9th, 1912, Carlisle faced Army at West Point. Among the defenders trying to stop Jim was a young cadet named Dwight Eisenhower. On one play, Eisenhower launched himself at Jim and injured his knee, a career-ending injury for the future president. Decades later, President Eisenhower would say, "Here and there are some people who are supremely endowed. My memory goes back to Jim Thorpe. He never practiced in his life, and he could do anything better than any other football player I ever saw." Carlisle destroyed Army 27-6. Jim scored twice and dominated both sides of the ball. Over the 1911 and 1912 seasons, Carlisle went 23 wins, 2 losses, 1 tie. Jim was named first-team All-American both years. But football, as it turned out, was only the beginning. Stockholm, the 1912 Olympics. In the spring of 1912, Jim Thorpe decided to try out for the U.S. Olympic team. He'd barely competed in track and field during the previous 2 years, focusing on football. But with a few months before the Olympics, Warner thought, why not? Jim trained casually. He added events he'd never seriously attempted: pole vault, javelin, discus, hammer throw, the 56-pound weight. His natural athleticism compensated for lack of technical training. At the Olympic trials at Celtic Park in New York, Jim's all-around ability stood out immediately. He qualified for both the pentathlon and the decathlon, multi-event competitions that would test speed, strength, endurance, and technique. In July of 1912, Jim sailed to Stockholm, Sweden, aboard the SS Finland with the rest of the U.S. Olympic team. While other athletes rested, Jim trained on the ship's deck, running, jumping, practicing his form. The 5th Olympiad opened in Stockholm on July 6, 1912. 28 nations, 2,400 athletes. Jim Thorpe was 24 years old. The pentathlon came first: long jump, javelin, 200-meter dash, discus, 1,500-meter run. Jim won the long jump, won the 200-meter dash, won the discus, won the 1,500 meters. He only placed 3rd in the javelin, but it didn't matter. He dominated 4 of 5 events. His victory was so complete that the Finnish athlete who finished 2nd, Ferdinand Bai, would later say he was embarrassed to accept the silver medal. American track legend Martin Sheridan, a 5-time Olympic gold medalist, approached Jim after the pentathlon. He shook Jim's hand. "Jim, my boy, you're a great man. I never expect to look upon a finer athlete." Sheridan told a reporter from the New York World, "Thorpe is the greatest athlete that ever lived. He has me beaten 50 ways. Even when I was in my prime, I could not do what he did today." The decathlon was even more impressive. 10 events over 3 days: 100 meters, long jump, shot put, high jump, 400 meters, 110-meter hurdles, discus, pole vault, javelin, 1,500 meters. Jim won 4 events outright, placed in the top 4 in 6 others. His final score, 8,412 points out of a possible 10,000. The record would stand for decades. On July 15, 1912, King Gustav V of Sweden presented Jim Thorpe with 2 gold medals, one for the pentathlon, one for the decathlon. The king also gave him a bronze bust of himself and a jewel-encrusted Viking ship from Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. King Gustav shook Jim's hand and spoke the words that would follow him forever: "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." Jim, never comfortable with formality, replied simply, "Thanks, King." Jim returned to America a hero. Parades in New York, Philadelphia, Carlisle, Newspapers called him the greatest athlete in the world. Warner said, "He's the finest all-around athlete in history." For 6 months, Jim Thorpe stood at the absolute peak of athletic achievement. The Sac and Fox boy from Oklahoma had conquered the world. Then came January of 1913, and everything fell apart. The scandal. 1913. The Worcester Telegram broke the story on January 22, 1913. Under the headline "Thorpe with Professionals," the newspaper revealed that Jim had played semi-professional baseball in 1909 and 1910 for Rocky Mount and Fayetteville in the Eastern Carolina League. He'd been paid $15 per week, $15. Under Olympic rules of that era, any athlete who had received money for playing sports was considered a professional. Professionals were banned from Olympic competition. The rules were strict, absolute, and enforced selectively. Many college athletes played summer baseball under assumed names. Everyone knew it. The Amateur Athletic Union looked the other way unless they wanted to make an example of someone. Jim hadn't used an assumed name. He'd played openly, naively unaware he was violating Olympic rules. Warner had known but said nothing, perhaps hoping it wouldn't matter. Now it mattered. The Amateur Athletic Union demanded Jim return his medals. The American Olympic Committee started proceedings to strip him of his titles. Jim, devastated, wrote a letter that was published in newspapers nationwide. The letter read, in part, "I hope I will be partly excused by the fact that I was simply an Indian schoolboy and I did not know all about such things. In fact, I did not know that I was doing wrong because I was doing what I knew several other college men had done." His plea made no difference. On January 27, 1913, the AAU declared Jim Thorpe a professional retroactively. The International Olympic Committee demanded he return his medals. His name was erased from Olympic records, his scores deleted. Ferdinand Bai and Hugo Wieslander, who'd finished second in the pentathlon and decathlon, were declared winners, though both men refused the honor, insisting Thorpe was the true champion. Jim packed up his medals, his trophies, the Viking ship, and shipped them back to the IOC. At 25 years old, Jim Thorpe learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. The system that celebrated you could destroy you just as quickly. But Jim Thorpe was not a man who quit. If they wouldn't let him be an amateur, he'd be the greatest professional athlete in history. The professional years. Baseball, 1913 to 1919. In February of 1913, Jim signed with the New York Giants baseball team. Manager John McGraw offered him a $4,500 contract, significant money at the time. Jim played outfield. He had speed, a strong arm, and power, but baseball requires precision, timing, thousands of repetitions to master. Jim had relied his whole life on natural ability. Baseball demanded practice, and Jim never liked practice. Over 6 seasons with the Giants, Cincinnati Reds, and Boston Braves, Jim's statistics were modest. A .252 lifetime batting average, 7 home runs, 91 runs scored. Respectable, but not remarkable. His best season came in 1919 with Boston, when he hit 327 in 60 games. But by then, Jim was 31, and his career was winding down. Baseball, it turned out, was Jim's worst sport, which says everything about how otherworldly his other abilities were. The professional years. Football, 1915 to 1928. Football was different. Football was where Jim became legend. In 1915, Jim signed with the Canton Bulldogs of Ohio for the then astronomical sum of $250 per game. The Bulldogs, a semi-professional team, became the best team in America with Jim on the roster. Over the 1915, 16, 17, 19, and 20 seasons, Canton was virtually unstoppable. Jim played every position in the backfield: runner, blocker, kicker, punter, defender. He'd kick 50-yard field goals, then run 95 yards for touchdowns, then tackle opposing runners with bone-crushing force. One opponent said, Trying to tackle Jim Thorpe was like trying to tackle a locomotive. You might slow him down, but you weren't stopping him. In 1920, representatives from 14 professional football teams met in Canton, Ohio. They formed the American Professional Football Association, the organization that would become the National Football League. Jim Thorpe was elected the league's first president, largely as a symbolic figurehead to lend credibility to the fledgling sport. He held the title for one season before stepping down to focus on playing. From 1920 to 1928, Jim bounced around professional football. Canton, Cleveland, Oorang Indians, Rock Island, New York Giants, Chicago Cardinals, 9 teams in 7 years. The money was never great. Professional football in the 20s paid poorly, but Jim played because he loved it. His final game came in 1928 with the Chicago Cardinals. Jim was 41 years old. He'd played professional football for 13 seasons, punishing his body in an era before face masks, padding, or protective equipment. When he finally hung up his cleats, Jim Thorpe had proven something important. Professional football could survive, could attract fans, could become America's game. He'd helped invent the modern NFL. IVA. The first marriage, 1913 to 1925. In 1913, Jim married Eva Miller, a young woman he'd met at Carlisle. She was sweet, shy, supportive. They seemed happy at first. They bought a house in Yale, Oklahoma in 1917, the Jim Thorpe House. It's called now a museum. 3 bedrooms, a porch, ordinary. Eva gave birth to their first child, James Jr., in 1915. Jim adored the boy, called him Junior. Teammates remembered seeing Jim and Junior on hotel lawns during spring training, the boy climbing up one of Jim's arms and down the other, both of them laughing. Then came 1918. The influenza pandemic swept across America, killing an estimated 675,000 people. The Spanish flu didn't discriminate. It killed young and old, healthy and sick. In September of 1918, Jim and Eva were traveling back from New York when Junior fell ill. At first, it seemed minor, just a fever, they thought. On September 28, 1918, Junior died. The diagnosis was inflammatory rheumatism, complicated by the flu. He was 3 years old. Friends said Jim never recovered from Junior's death. Al Schacht, a teammate, remembered, Jim and that boy were inseparable. After Junior died, Jim was never the same. The light went out of him. Jim began drinking, not just socially, heavily, destructively. He'd disappear for days. Eva tried to hold the marriage together, but Jim was somewhere else, lost in grief. They had 3 more children, Gail, Charlotte, and Grace Frances. Jim provided for them financially, but was increasingly absent emotionally. He'd be on the road for baseball or football, or he'd be drinking, or he'd just be gone. In 1925, Eva filed for divorce, citing desertion. The marriage had lasted 12 years. Jim didn't contest it. FREDA. The second marriage, 1926 to 1941. In 1926, Jim married Frida Kirkpatrick. She worked as manager for a baseball team Jim was playing for. Frida was practical, tough, no nonsense. She understood athletes. She thought she could handle Jim. They had 4 sons, Philip, William, Richard, and John. Everyone called him Jack. 4 boys meant financial pressure, and Jim was still bouncing between football teams, playing in an era when even star players made modest money. The Great Depression hit in 1929, just as Jim's playing career ended. At 41, battered from decades of football, Jim retired from sports. He had no savings, no pension, no plan. He tried everything, painted houses for 50 cents an hour, dug ditches, worked as a bouncer at Los Angeles bars, took bit parts in Hollywood movies, playing stereotypical Indians in westerns. Between 1931 and 1950, Jim appeared in over 60 films, usually uncredited, rarely speaking, just another native face in war paint. The drinking got worse. Jim would disappear on binges. Frida would find him days later in some bar, broke, ashamed. In 1937, Jim tried to start a casting company to pressure Hollywood studios into hiring real Native Americans for Indian roles instead of white actors in makeup. It went nowhere. The studios weren't interested in authenticity. Frida held on for 15 years, but by 1941, the marriage was dead. She filed for divorce, exhausted from trying to save a man who couldn't save himself. Jim didn't contest that divorce either. Patricia. The third marriage, 1945 to 1953. On June 2, 1945, Jim married Patricia Gladys Askew. She was younger, ambitious, calculating. She saw in Jim a name that could be leveraged, a story that could be sold. Patricia and Jim didn't have children. She became, in essence, his manager, booking speaking engagements, trying to generate income from his fame. In 1950, the Associated Press conducted a poll of almost 400 sports writers. The question, who was the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century? Jim Thorpe won overwhelmingly. The recognition felt hollow. Jim was 62, living in a trailer park in Lomita, California. He was broke, his health failing. The greatest athlete of the half-century couldn't afford medical care. In 1951, Warner Brothers released Jim Thorpe, All-American, starring Burt Lancaster as Jim. The movie was Hollywood through and through, dramatic, inspiring, mostly fiction. It ended with Jim vindicated, celebrated, redeemed. In reality, Jim received no money from the film. He'd sold the rights to MGM in 1931 for $1,500 and a promise of future considerations that never materialized. Patricia took Jim to the premiere. Photographers snapped pictures of them on the red carpet. Jim smiled for the cameras, playing the role of the dignified legend. Inside, he watched Burt Lancaster portray a sanitized version of his life. That night, Jim got drunk. The end. March 28, 1953. Jim Thorpe died of a heart attack on March 28, 1953, in his trailer home in Lomita, California. He was 65 years old, though some records say he was 64, even his birth year remained disputed. Patricia immediately took control of the arrangements. Jim's children from his first 2 marriages, 7 surviving kids, assumed their father would be buried in Oklahoma, in Sac and Fox land, near his mother and other family members. They began planning a traditional Native American funeral. On April 12, 1953, relatives gathered on a farm near Prague, Oklahoma. The Sac and Fox Thunder Clan prepared the ceremony. Jim's children were there: Grace, Charlotte, Gail, Philip, William, Richard, Jack. Then Patricia arrived. She pulled up with a hearse, a highway patrolman, and a court order. She informed the family that she, as Jim's legal widow, had the right to determine burial arrangements. She decided Jim would not be buried in Oklahoma. The family was stunned. What was she talking about? Patricia explained. She'd been contacted by 2 small Pennsylvania towns, Mauch-Chunk and East Mauch-Chunk. The towns were struggling economically. They offered to merge, rename themselves Jim Thorpe, and build a monument if Patricia would allow them to bury Jim there. Jim had never been to Mauch-Chunk in his life. He'd never even heard of it. But Patricia accepted the deal. The towns would pay $10,000. They'd build a memorial. They'd attract tourists, and Patricia would receive ongoing payments. Jim's children protested. Jack, his youngest son, shouted that this was desecration, that their father belonged in Oklahoma with his people. Patricia had the law on her side. The highway patrolman made it clear, if anyone interfered, they'd be arrested. The hearse drove away with Jim's body. Grace Thorpe would later say, that was the final indignity. After everything Jim survived, he couldn't even be buried with his own people. The town. Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. In 1954, the towns of Mauch-Chunk and East Mauch-Chunk officially merged and renamed themselves the borough of Jim Thorpe. They built a memorial, Jim's tomb, flanked by 2 statues showing him in athletic poses. The monument stands on 20 acres outside town. Jim's body was interred there in 1957. He'd been dead 4 years, passed around like a commodity. The borough of Jim Thorpe became a tourist destination. People came to see where Jim Thorpe was buried. The town's economy improved. But Jim's children never stopped fighting. In 1973, Jack Thorpe, who'd become principal chief of the Sac and Fox Nation, began formally requesting that the town return his father's remains. The answer was always no. Richard Thorpe, another son, said, "Dad had never been there in his life. They're using his corpse like a mascot." In 2010, Jack Thorpe filed a federal lawsuit against the borough of Jim Thorpe, citing the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. The lawsuit sought to return Jim's remains to Oklahoma for proper burial. In 2011, while the case was pending, Jack Thorpe died of cancer at age 73. He was buried in Garden Grove Cemetery in Oklahoma, in the same plot he'd reserved for his father. The lawsuit continued. In 2013, a federal judge ruled in favor of the Thorpe family. But in 2014, an appeals court overturned that decision, ruling that the act didn't apply because Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, wasn't a museum or federal agency. In 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear a final appeal. Jim Thorpe remains buried in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. His children are all now deceased. The fight for his remains ended not with justice, but with exhaustion. Mayor Michael Safranco of Jim Thorpe said, "We lived up to our end of the bargain. That's about as American as you can get." Perhaps, but there's another way to view it. Jim Thorpe spent his life being used by boarding schools that tried to erase his identity, by sports organizations that took his medals, by a system that profited from his talents while giving him nothing in return. Even in death, he wasn't free. Redemption. The fight for the medals. For decades after Jim's death, his family fought to restore his Olympic medals and records. His children, particularly Grace Thorpe and his son Jack, lobbied Congress, contacted the International Olympic Committee, generated media attention. In 1973, the Amateur Athletic Union officially restored Jim's amateur status, but the IOC refused to act. Then Robert Wheeler and Florence Ridlon, two activists, took up the cause. They discovered evidence that Jim's disqualification had occurred outside the 30-day window required by Olympic rules. In other words, the IOC had violated its own regulations when it stripped his medals. Armed with this evidence and support from Congress, they founded the Jim Thorpe Foundation in 1982. On October 13, 1982, 29 years after Jim's death, the IOC Executive Committee voted to restore Jim's medals. Sort of. In a bizarre compromise, the IOC declared Jim co-champion with Ferdinand Bai in the pentathlon and Hugo Wieslander in the decathlon. Both Bai and Wieslander had insisted for decades that Jim was the sole champion. Both had refused to accept their medals while Jim lived, but the IOC wouldn't fully admit its mistake. On January 18, 1983, two of Jim's children, Gail and Bill Thorpe, were presented with commemorative replica medals. The original medals were never recovered. They'd been stolen from museums years earlier. The IOC's official records continued to list Jim as co-champion until 2022. 2022, 110 years after Stockholm, 69 years after Jim's death. Only then did the International Olympic Committee finally restore Jim Thorpe as the sole gold medalist in the 1912 decathlon and pentathlon. On July 15, 2022, the IOC announced, "We made a mistake in 1913. Jim Thorpe was, is, and will remain the sole winner of both events." The announcement came 110 years to the day after King Gustav told Jim he was the greatest athlete in the world. Better late than never, perhaps, but Jim never knew. His children never saw full vindication in their lifetimes. Justice had arrived decades after anyone who suffered the injustice was alive to appreciate it. The legacy. What do we make of Jim Thorpe? His statistics are almost absurd. 2 Olympic gold medals, college football All-American twice, 13 seasons of professional football, first president of what became the NFL, 6 seasons of Major League Baseball, professional basketball player, a man who excelled at literally every sport he tried. In 1950, the Associated Press named him the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century. In 1999, both ESPN and the Associated Press ranked him among the top 10 athletes of the entire century, ahead of Joe Louis, Jack Dempsey, Jesse Owens, behind only Babe Ruth, Michael Jordan, and a handful of others. The Jim Thorpe Award, given annually to the best defensive back in college football since 1986, carries his name. The Pro Football Hall of Fame inducted him in its inaugural class of 1963. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame, multiple Native American Sports Halls of Fame. In 2024, President Joe Biden announced Jim would receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. But Jim Thorpe's true legacy isn't in statistics or awards, it's in what he represented. He was the first Native American Olympic gold medalist. He competed in an era when indigenous people were considered inferior, when boarding schools actively tried to destroy Native culture, when laws prevented Native Americans from voting or owning property. Every time Jim stepped onto a field, he was fighting not just opponents, but centuries of racism. Every touchdown, every medal, every victory was a refutation of white supremacy. And he did it with grace. Despite everything taken from him, his medals, his earnings, his dignity, Jim never became bitter. He never stopped advocating for his people. He tried to create opportunities for Native American actors. He spoke about indigenous rights. He remained proud of his Sac and Fox heritage. Grace Thorpe, his daughter, became a prominent environmental and native rights activist. She said, "Dad taught us that being Indian wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. He showed the world what we could do." The man. But who was Jim Thorpe, the man? By most accounts, he was quiet, humble, uncomfortable with fame. He preferred listening to talking. He'd sit in the back of rooms, nursing a drink, watching. He was generous to a fault. He'd give money to friends who needed it, even when he had none to spare. He never learned to save, plan, or invest. Money came in, money went out. He was a terrible father. He loved his children, but was rarely present. He'd be traveling for sports, or drinking, or just absent. His kids grew up knowing their father was famous, but rarely saw him. He was a worse husband. 3 marriages, 3 divorces or near divorces at death. He couldn't stay faithful, couldn't stay sober, couldn't stay in one place. The drinking was his demon. After Junior's death, Jim used alcohol to numb the pain. By his 40s, it had become addiction. He'd go on benders lasting days. Patricia would find him passed out in Lowe's Angels bars. But people who knew Jim said he wasn't mean. He didn't get violent. He just disappeared into himself. Carlisle teammate Gus Welch said, "Jim carried sadness in him. You could see it in his eyes. He'd lost too much. His brother, his parents, his son, his medals. I think he was tired of losing." The final irony. Here's the irony. Jim Thorpe made almost no money from athletics. The Olympics were amateur, no payment. College football was amateur, no payment. His brief baseball career earned modest wages. Professional football in the 20s paid almost nothing, sometimes $50 per game, sometimes less. The movies paid little for bit parts. Speaking engagements dried up during the Depression. Jim died nearly penniless. The greatest athlete of the century couldn't afford his own funeral. His widow had to sell his corpse to finance burial arrangements. Meanwhile, his image has generated millions. The town of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, has built its entire tourist economy around his name. The NFL he helped found generates billions annually. Sports memorabilia bearing his name sells for thousands. But Jim got nothing. That's the American way, isn't it? Use people, extract value, discard them when they're no longer useful. Jim Thorpe was used by boarding schools to prove Indians could be civilized, used by Carlisle to defeat rival schools, used by the Olympics to showcase American dominance, used by professional sports to attract fans, used by Hollywood to play stereotypes, used by a Pennsylvania town to boost tourism. Everyone profited from Jim.